it's really my pleasure to introduce someone who needs no introduction. I don't think you've been. I don't think you were there the first day, but you're one of our founding members as well. And you've been a very loyal and gracious member. And Ruthie, I'll let you do any more introduction.
All right.
All right.
Well, maybe this will be a little bit of fun tonight too. Since this is the Historical Society, maybe we should have a little bit of history as well. And so this is about our state, our area, history, ghosts, people, tales, trivia, facts, and maybe a little fable as well. Now, unfortunately, we all hear the phrase a lot of times, thank goodness for Mississippi. I want to make it, thank goodness for Mississippi. You know, I truly believe that we are a fantastic area. Mississippi, a state of tremendous natural beauty, populated by people of genteel culture and filled with magnificent sights. Stately, elegant, beautiful. But there's another Mississippi lurking behind all that loveliness and sophistication. A state with a complicated history, a state where pure wackiness, eccentric characters, crazy happenings, extraordinarily weird and quirky events, maybe even some spooky places, bizarre landmarks, it's all perfectly normal. Remember, it even takes help from Mississippi for the rest of the country to get into outer space. So here we go. First, a little history. Our coast area, these lower 6 counties, they say this area has probably been populated for maybe even 12,000 years. Of course, it was nothing but the Indians at first. Spanish explorers passed through what is Mississippi, maybe down here along the coast they actually set foot, maybe. As early as the 1540s. And the Indians were really it until 1699 when the French came and Fort Maurepas over there in Ocean Springs was established. The French stayed around, but in 1763, as a result of the 7 Years' War, when France lost to England, we became British West Florida. Then Spain declared war on England in 1779, and in 1783, the Treaty of Paris gave British West Florida to Spain. And there was a Spanish West Florida, and we stayed Spanish until 1810, and then the Republic of West Florida for a very brief time. And then the United States gained control of this area in about 1811. Now this is down here where we are. 1817, Mississippi statehood. We seceded in 1861 from the United States, and for a short period of time, very short time, we were independent, and that's when the Magnolia flag was flying. Then the 4 years of the Confederacy, and in 1865, back into the U.S. of A. No changes since then, and that's why all these 8 flags that have flown over this area. The Indians did not have a flag, or there would have been 9. We'd have to put a totem pole up, I guess. Now, a little bit of history about all these coast towns. Waveland, one of the youngsters, wasn't incorporated until 1972, but had homes and businesses maybe as early as 1800. New Orleans folks came. It was really a vacation spot for them. Waveland has been devastated, needless to say, but it's really making a comeback, and these hurricanes that do come through. Now, there was a very famous pirate house there. Did Jean Lafitte actually own it? There were some Laffittes that owned property around during that time, but was it Lafitte? Let's pretend that it was, even if it wasn't. Now, Bay St. Louis. First, the bay itself, which is the Bay of St. Louis. It was discovered in 1699 by D'Iberville and Bienville, and they named it the Bay of St. Louis because they were there on St. Louis Day. Now, it was probably about 1721 before any settlers came and stayed, and it was originally Shieldsboro, incorporated in 1818. There'd been a grant to a Thomas Shields early in the 1700s. Now, that was a French land grant then. It was a real tourist mecca for folks from New Orleans, and even a lot of people from the Natchez area would come to the coast and visit there in Bay St. Louis. And it became the city of Bay St. Louis by name in 1882. Pass Christiana. It takes its name because there was a deep water pass in the Gulf that was named for Nicholas Christian Ladnier, and thus Pass Christian. And this man lived on Cat Island in 1746, this Nicholas Christian Ladnier. And by the 1830s, Pass Christian was a real tourist mecca. There were several fine hotels, at least fine for the early 1830s. They had a post office there by 1839, and it became a city in 1848. Now, the Pass, remember, is a peninsula. It does stick out just like one. Little, but it's there. All right, Long Beach. Settled in the 1700s by the Ladnier family. Now, that is the same man that lived on Cat Island, but he got a Spanish land grant for the land directly across from the island. He built a home there that had real big chimneys, and the area's first name was the Chimneys, because these chimneys that remained after the house burned. Mr. McCon bought the Ladner claim around 1850 and named his house Rosalie, and so the town was then Rosalie. Then the railroads came along. The first train station was built by Mr. Scott. Then it was Scott Station. In 1882, it officially became known as Long Beach and was incorporated in 1905. Now, the area around Long Beach was primarily interested in commerce and farming. It was not tourism. Among other vegetables, one that really thrived was radishes. In 1921, it is said that 300 train loads of radishes were sent to the north. Real long radishes. And that, folks, is a lot of radishes. Mary Ellen Alexander wrote the book From Rosalie to Radishes, which was a rather comprehensive book about the history of it. Fruit trees abounded in that area. And there was even in Long Beach what we all called the Glad Farm. The Danielson family, Janelle Blocker sitting right here, her family had a gladioli farm in Long Beach. And here she is right here. I'm so glad she's here tonight. This was in it, I promised you, Del. Mississippi City isn't anymore, but almost the home of the University of Mississippi, and was our county seat for years. Now, I'm not going to go into the history of Gulfport, but we all owe a big thanks to Captain William Hardy, who was in the Confederate forces. He was a captain in Company H, the Mississippi Infantry. He was the dreamer that brought Gulfport into being. But the money man was Joseph Jones, who was in Company H, 91st Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry. He was wounded and discharged, but between the two of them, Jones, I've read, when the federal government wasn't going to dredge to the harbor, he paid to have it done. To get to the port of Gulfport. We owe a lot to both of these men. 75 years ago now, the first CB detachment located here. And to quote one writer, "Today the Gulfport CB Center is the finest to be had in the world and an integral part of the Gulfport community, readily aiding its coastal neighbors, whether in the face of disaster or helping to build a new playground." In mid-July, they announced the solar farm that was going to be placed there, and it is said that that is going to be a big factor in keeping the CB base off the BRAC, that base closing thing, keeping it off the BRAC list. Great Southern Golf Club. Continuous operation since 1910, the oldest in Mississippi. There was even a golf tournament called the Gulfport Open. And in 1945, at the Gulfport Open, Sam Snead beat Byron Nelson in a playoff. Now, Betty Shaw's book even has a picture, I think, of the fairgrounds that were in Gulfport in the early 1900s, approximately where Milner Stadium is today. And they had horse races in Gulfport at this fairgrounds. Now, Biloxi, another town that's on a peninsula down here. It didn't really grow a lot until statehood, but it was always the center for all these flags that were flying over our country at that time. It was a resort, and of course the seafood industry was critical in them. And partly because of that, I mean, the seafood industry down here, during the war between the states when food was short in so many places, thanks to mullet, Biloxi bacon, people really weren't starving to death down here. Now, Keesler Air Force Base had its beginnings in World War II. And since my husband's from Greenwood, I do have to point out that Keesler was named for Lieutenant Samuel Keesler, Jr., who was a native of Greenwood, Mississippi. He was in aerial gunnery and in aerial gunnery and artillery fire control. His plane was shot down during World War I in October of 1918 at Verdun. He was captured by German troops, and he died the very next day from his injuries. So, Keesler and Greenwood, big connection there. Samuel Keesler did receive the Distinguished Flying Cross. Now, Biloxi's economy today is casinos, tourism, seafood, and the military, of course. Ocean Springs, okay, 1699, it goes way back. It was the first French stronghold on the coast, the first non-Indian settlement. Now, Ocean Springs is really on pretty high ground. It's accessible by boat. It's easily defended. Seafood, lumber farming, charcoal were all part of its early economy. It had springs there. It was originally named Lynchburg Springs. It became Ocean Springs in 1854, and a big hotel was built there. And Ocean Springs is still pretty well known for its slow, easy lifestyle. Gaucher, well, it was the Gaucher family, and that's the real newcomer here on the coast. It was not incorporated until 1986. For years, it was just a bedroom community of Pascagoula. Pascagoula had families living in that area possibly as early as 1718. But before World War II, it only had about 5,000 people living there. Shipbuilding had come by then, and Ingalls is still very much a part of the local economy. And this very day, the Secretary of the Navy was at Ingalls and just on the news tonight proclaiming what a wonderful place Ingalls is and how important it is to the Navy and to the shipbuilding. Pascagoula has always been more of an industrial town. Now, there is the LaPointe Krebs House that is documented as the oldest standing structure in Mississippi, and possibly the oldest confirmed building in the Deep South. And that is from University of Southern Mississippi research that is saying it could well be that old. Some areas, communities down here, were named what they were named for a reason. For instance, Coalville. Coal was on schooners going to New Orleans. Wool Market. Yes, there were sheep around here. We get to the islands. Ship was the Iberville's first base. And it said, one of the stories about why it's named Ship Island is as they were heading up, and that is Bienville and D'Iberville, in 1699, around in there, they saw this thing on the horizon and thought it was an enemy ship. And as they were getting there and it was looming larger and larger, they thought, oh dear, what are we sailing towards? And they were very glad when it merely turned out to be an island. We know about Cat Island being named Cat because they thought it was cats when it was really raccoons. Oh, Horn Island is famous for Walter Anderson, Petit Bois, deer. The Isle of Caprice, that was a huge and popular tourist spot, gambling and so on, but it sort of went underwater after the 20s. Now, each town down here has its own personality, each one of these coast towns. But they were tied together early on by timber, by charcoal, fishing, tourism, Today, some of the common threads still, but it's primarily commerce and the military and tourism that are binding these places together. Now, Harrison County was named for the 9th President of the United States, William Henry Harrison. Get to the wall between the states area, very little activity here on the coast. Fort Massachusetts was in the hand of the federal troops. Food shortage were prevalent, but the seafood helped keep us going then. The Battle of Pass Christian was really about our only conflict, if it can be called such. The 3rd Mississippi Regiment, which so many people in this area did enlist in the 3rd Mississippi Infantry, had heard that it was stationed in Pass Christian, but they had heard that there was an imminent attack coming to Biloxi, so they marched out of Pass Christian heading to Biloxi. But the USS Massachusetts pulled in at Pass Christian and started shelling, trying to obliterate the docks and everything that was there in Pass Christian. Shelling was very brief because a lady dashed to her balcony upstairs and was waving either a tablecloth or a sheet, and that is known as the bed sheet surrender. The Union troops did come ashore. They did plunder the town. They went back to their ship, and that was the end of our war between the states battle here on the coast. Now, we've also got some ghosts around here. Now, the thing about ghosts is if you believe in a ghost, you believe in your ghost. And I believe in my ghost, but we might not believe in each other's ghosts. And this is so true about ghost stories around here. Grace Lawn is said to have had some. I don't know if they're still there. Do we still have ghosts in the new one?
I have not heard of any in the new one.
In the new one, but there was a man that would be photographed, and there was even a young girl that was seen walking around, but she had a mini skirt on, so she was even from the 60s.
Might have been Libby. It might have been Libby with the mini skirt.
It might have been Libby. Who knows? It could have been. The port of Gulfport has one that I think is particularly fascinating. There was the man who worked on the emergency cruise, and there was a crane out there, and the big long arms that cranes had, and something happened out here. And so the repairman got up there. He was heading out on the long arm, didn't wear his safety harness. Uh-oh. And the man who was operating the crane decided that he was going to take a coffee break. So here the man was out there, and he said, well, I can check it real quickly. Well, lo and behold, the wind got real strong out there, and he went falling off, but was able to grab onto a cable and another thing. And he was standing there screaming and waving in the breeze with the heavy wind. And he looked up, and a man came, grabbed his arms, pulled him up, and laid him out on the catwalk. And as he lay there, grateful, thanking, his eyes closed, several people did come running up that had seen him flapping in the breeze. And he said, but where's the other man? And they said, no other man here. Several days later, he was looking at some pictures, and there was a man's picture, and he had been killed in a fire some years before, and he looked at the picture. And that was the man that had saved him. He'd never seen the thing before. He'd never seen the picture. And the people that were there said, oh, he just managed to pull himself up. There was nobody else there. But the man that was saved so believed in what he had seen that he took flowers every year to the man's grave in honor of his saving his life. Wow. There's even one out on Magnolia Drive that a lady that limps along out there on Magnolia Street, out there in Hansborough. Don't you know Hansborough's got some wonderful ghosts? Both were. I think the most common one is Jefferson Davis sitting on his bench, looking out at the water. He's seen there very often. But there's also the story about a lady who arrived at the ticket desk, and she was leaving, and she was just very indignant that a man in period dress had told her that she was stepping in his gardens. And she said, a reenactor should not act like that. But there were no reenactors there that day. No one could do it. And I think that Jefferson must have just been taking care of Verena's Gardens that day. Of course, the Singing River, we all know the story about the Pascagoula Indians choosing death over imprisonment by the Biloxi Indians, or death. Horn Island has one. Is it Walter Anderson? Cat Island, could it be a soldier that had trained some dogs there? Ship Island, there's definitely a Union soldier that patrols, and the resident Confederate soldier always tips his hat as the true Southern gentleman every time he passes somebody when he's out walking on the beach. Now, let's talk about pride in Mississippi. Just a lot of trivia and funny little facts. Okay. Jackson, Mississippi, the only city in the United States that hosts an international ballet competition. The first lung, heart, and kidney transplants were all done at the University of Mississippi Medical Center by Dr. James Harvey. DeLow, Mississippi. It was featured in the July 6, 1942 Life magazine. A town with a population of 400 sent 150 men to World War II. Wow. More men to the war than any other town its size. We have more churches per capita than any other state. The first female federal judge was a native of Hazelhurst. She was appointed by Truman. Her name was Bernita Shelton Matthews. She had ended up marrying a lawyer and living in the District of Columbia. Mississippi established the first public or state college for women. It was then IC&C, the Industrial Institute and College. Of course, that's what I would still call MSCW, the Mississippi University for Women. Mississippi College was the first co-ed college in the United States to grant a degree to a woman. And we were the first state to have a planned junior college system. LQC Lamar, Lucius Quintus Cincinnatus Lamar, one of only two people that has been a U.S. representative, a U.S. senator, a member of the cabinet. He was Secretary of Interior under Cleveland, and a Supreme Court justice. And his own home in Oxford is said to be one of the best free attractions in the state of Mississippi. Then there's Friendship Cemetery in Columbus, where in April of 1866, the widows and sisters and mothers of Confederate dead went to the cemetery to place flowers on their family members that were buried there. But they also placed flowers on the graves of all of the Union that were buried in Friendship Cemetery. This act was immortalized in a poem entitled The Blue and the Gray by Francis Miles French. And that event and that poem led to Decoration Day, which is now Veterans Day. And sometimes that's even called the flowers that helped heal a nation. Some more little trivia. Holmes County, birthplace of the Eastern Star and 4-H clubs. Now let's go on about eating in Mississippi, the culinary side of Mississippi, where it said that eating out is not a meal, it's an experience. We've got a bunch of famous cookbook authors and chefs that are Mississippians. There's even a website that's something like MississippiSeafoodTrail.com, so you can go all over and find restaurants all over the state where you can get good seafood. Now, there's even a beverage, Barks, 1898, right here on our coast. We've all heard about Doe's in Greenville, where they sell steak by the pound or by its weight by the ounces. Very famous for its hot tamales, too. Lusco's in Greenwood has little booths that you sit in that have curtains that they draw, and to call your waiter, you push a button. It's even said that in Mississippi, gas stations can have really good food. Now, if you're from Corinth, you've heard of the slug burgers. They were made famous at a drugstore in Corinth. Now, why they called that, nobody's really positive, but they think that it's because they sold for a slug during the Depression, slug being a slang term for a nickel, but no slugs in them. And what I think is even worse sounding, to tell you the truth, is that at Johnny's Drive-In in Tupelo, they sold dough, D-O-U-G-H, dough burgers. Because during some very lean economic times, they had to add dough to the meat to make it stretch a little bit further. McAllister's Deli, first one, 1989 in Oxford, Mississippi. And the first McDonald's in Mississippi was right up Taft Road in Biloxi. So right there. Now, in regard to eating, Mississippi's state beverage is milk. Good for us, isn't it? There was recently a book published entitled A Year in Mississippi, and it tells all about fairs and festivals all over the state. There's the Blueberry Festival in Poplarville every June. And one report says that there are almost 10 million pounds of blueberries produced annually around here. And Corinth really does have every July their Slug Burger Festival. There's a Choctaw Indian Fair, a dairy festival in Tylertown. Walthall County calls itself the cream pitcher of America. Milk is the state beverage. The Great Delta Bear Affair. It's in Rolling Fork, and that's commemorating Teddy Roosevelt and his refusal to shoot the bear in 1902. Now, the teddy bear was created by a New York merchant, and we know the rest of that story too. But do you know that there is a teddy bear museum? But it's not in the Delta. It's in Picayune with 15,000 teddy bears. Now, the official toy of the state of Mississippi is the teddy bear. Of course, Tupelo does have the Elvis Festival. Memphis claims him, but we birthed him here in Mississippi. Tupelo does have a life-size statue of Elvis at age 13 that shows him, that's his age when they moved to Memphis. And he's in overalls and clutching his guitar. Elvis, the king. It is said by many that we don't remember him. We just never forgot him. And there's a museum there for him as well. Now, some towns even have a theme. A couple of them. One, Meridian, plays up its carousels. And all over the city in various places they have these huge horses, you know, the merry-go-round horses, made out of fiberglass. And it's because in Highland Park, there in Meridian, there's a big carousel that was designed and built by Detzel, D-E-N-T-Z-E-L. But he was a world-renowned maker of merry-go-rounds. It was bought by Meridian in 1909 after it had been used at the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904. They built a carriage house around it, and it's the only original carousel building remaining that was built from a Detzel blueprint. The carousel's on the National Register of Historical Places, and the carousel and house are a National Historic Landmark. Now, Belzona, Mississippi. Of course, they do have the Catfish Festival. This is Humphreys County, the catfish capital of the world. So Belzona's theme is catfish. There is a blues cat there that's honoring all the Delta musicians. There's even one they call the Moneybags cat in front of the local bank. Now, museums, they're all over the state. There's a Grammy Museum. The only one that is outside of Los Angeles is in Cleveland, Mississippi. Here in Gulfport, we do have a museum with some cars in it. I believe Phil Shaw could tell us about that and some military things. And there's a huge automobile museum in Tupelo as well. The birthplace of the Frog Museum. How about at Deer Creek, near Leland, thanks to Jim Henson's Love It. Kermit, born right there on Deer Creek. Opening this December, the Civil Rights Museum and the Museum of Mississippi History, both scheduled for December openings, and that's going to be the culmination of the bicentennial. And also in December, there's a new huge museum opening in Meridian that will be called the Mississippi Arts an entertainment experience that will be focusing on the state's legends and legacy in creative fields. Maybe it's going to show a little bit about what makes us such a climate for genius around here. Now, writing. One time, Mississippi, it had more nationally published authors than any other state. And yet we have a reputation that we're all illiterate around here. We've got to have the climate of genius, no question about it. Mississippi can claim one of the only 9 authors who has been on the New York Times bestseller list, both #1 in fiction and nonfiction. Anybody know who it is?
Grisham.
Nope.
Welty.
Nope.
Walter Percy.
No. Let me tell you the names of his books. One was Where is Joe Merchant?
Ah.
Another one is A Pirate Looks at 50. You've got it. And then his fiction, Tales from Margaritaville. Jimmy Buffett, one of 9 men ever. And you know, he's also written some children's books with his eldest daughter, whose name is Savannah. Now, Jimmy, of course, was born in Pascagoula. His grandmother lived on 2nd Street in Gulfport, and some of you would perhaps remember Glover Roberts. He and Jimmy were first cousins. Of course, our writers that we really think of as writers rather than Jimmy Buffett, William Faulkner, Eudora Welty, they've won virtually every prize that can be won, of course, Faulkner including the Nobel. Tennessee Williams, Beth Henley, Harding Carter. Locally, Natasha Trethewey just won the Pulitzer in poetry. Jasmine Ward from DeLille won the National Book Award in 2011 for Salvage the Bones, and she's a finalist in 2017 for Sing, Unburied Sing. It's her 3rd novel. Willie Morris, age 32, when he became the editor-in-chief of Harper's Magazine, the youngest in the magazine's history. And you could go on and on about that. We can sort of claim John Grisham, though he was born in Arkansas and lives in Virginia now, but I think he started his writing when he was in Mississippi. Our area, James Street, was from Lumberton, and Clayton Rand is our Gulfportian that we would remember. Entertainers. Jerry Clower, Jim Henson in the Muppets, Morgan Freeman, raised in Mississippi and now has ground zero in Clarksdale, Dana Andrews, Oprah Winfrey, and Robin Roberts keeps our coast and Pastor's Cheyenne known to the country, I think. In music, we borned a lot of great musicians, but we also borned the blues. It began with snippets of songs being sung by workers in Mississippi's cotton fields. Blues preceded jazz. And the Mississippi Blues Trail really takes note of the blues story in the state of Mississippi. 3 of the greatest ones are all raised in the Delta. Buddy Waters, Robert Johnson, who's buried north of Greenwood, and he's the one that reputedly sold his soul to the devil so that he would have some musical ability. B.B. King, his nickname when he was in Memphis was Blues Boy. So B.B. King, states recognize Lucille. Any of us with Mississippi tags drive around with Lucille on our tag every day, and I think I've just read that it will stay that way for several more years, that they're not going to change the style of it upcoming. Jimmy Duck Holmes, he was a guitarist and singer from Bentonia. His hands and guitar are on the Mississippi Bicentennial stamp. Jimmy Rogers, he has a museum there in Meridian, right close to the Carousel. It's in Highland Park there. Elvis, need we say more. But some more names like Faith Hill and Leanne Rhymes. Then Leontine Price. At her debut at the Metropolitan Opera, she received a 42-minute ovation, the longest in Met history. And her brother, Brigadier General George Baker Price, was the first black to become a general in the United States Army. Gulfport's Rachel Potter. In the arts, well, just on the coast, Walter Anderson, Dusty Ponche, George Orwell. Statewide in business, Jim Barksdale of Netscape. Fred Carl in Greenwood began Viking. Fred Smith, the founder of FedEx. Steinmart, first store was in Greenville, Mississippi. Cal Maine is the largest egg-producing company in the United States. PV Electronics, the world's largest manufacturer of electronics. It's in Meridian. There's a man named David Harrison from Columbus that holds a patent for something that there are almost 1 million of sold annually. This Mr. Harrison owns the patent for the padded toilet seat. Now, a long time ago, we still had some people that were well known in business. The first bottle of Dr. Tishner's was produced in Liberty, Mississippi. First Coca-Cola bottle was at Beatonhorns in Vicksburg. Pine Sol, invented in 1929 by a Jackson native named Harry Copeland. There's a store in Vicksburg that was named Phil Gilbert's. First place that shoes were ever sold in a box and by the pair. It used to be you just bought a shoe. So thanks to Phil Gilbert's in Vicksburg. John Stetson, yes, Stetson hats. He learned his trade right after the war between the states in Dunn's Falls, which is right close to Meridian, Mississippi. Now, sports. Mississippi's got a bunch of them, and so does the coast. Gulfport's Mary Mills was a golfer. Mary was the #1 golfer on her school team for her 4 years at Millsaps, and she played on the men's golf team. This was back in the early 60s when you wouldn't have had a girls' golf team at Millsaps. Mary won the USGA Women's Open, and she was the winner twice of the LPGA Championship. Brittany Reese, one of our locals right here. The Manning family, we all know and appreciate them, and I think particularly recently we've been seeing so much about the family and what they're trying to do for the University of Mississippi Medical Center. Now, Eli does have a house in Oxford, and it's said that even though the neighbors would say, don't bother him, he gets out and plays with all the neighborhood children when he's in residence in Oxford. Brett Favre made the kill in the Broke Spoke household names. Jerry Rice, the football player, widely considered to be the greatest player in NFL history, and without a doubt, the best wide receiver ever. That man grew up in Crawford, Mississippi, attended Octok High School, and played ball for Mississippi Valley State. Walter Payton from Columbia. He was the first football player to win a spot on the front of a Wheaties box. Now, did you know that Dizzy Dean had a brother? His nickname is Daffy Dean. Then there was a Slats Harden from Greenwood who won gold in the Berlin Olympics. Right here in Gulfport, a football name that's known as the Barney family. There have been several of the Barneys active in that. Now, just crazy trivia. When they were digging the Ross Barnett Reservoir in Jackson in 1962, they found the bones of a 40-million-year-old prehistoric whale. So, what is our state fossil? The prehistoric whale. And something I did not know until recently, Mississippi does have 3 international airports: Gulfport, Jackson, and Stennis. And I never could figure out why international airport. Seems you have to have a customs house to be an international airport. And Gulfport has had a customs house since the early 1900s. I mean, back when it was first being formed. So that's why Gulfport International Airport. Floral, Mississippi, the only petrified forest east of the Mississippi River. And our state stone is petrified wood. Okay, Mississippi, the first state to ratify the 18th Amendment, the Prohibition Amendment. Now, it's said that in 1966 there was a big party going on in Jackson. I think it might have been the Junior League annual ball or something. and it was raided, and all the booze was destroyed. And very shortly after that, Mississippi became the last state to ratify the 21st Amendment to repeal the 18th. Wideman's, if you're from Meridian or ever been there, you remember the crocks of peanut butter. That began, always on the tables, that began in World War II when there was a shortage of butter. And I have heard they can't do it anymore they don't have them anymore, which is such a shame. Some people say that down here in the South, in Mississippi, we do talk funny. But I think there are a couple of things that are rather strange pronunciations, like we have Lafayette County for Lafayette. And we have Bolivar County, named for Simon Bolivar. We have some towns that have some real funny names, like Delo, Possum Neck, Busy Corner, and we also have hot coffee and cold water. We have two presidential libraries, Grant at Mississippi State and Davis's. Beg your pardon?
You forgot Rolling Fork.
That's a good one, yes. Rolling Fork is another one. Now, Mississippi, the means of carrying out the death penalty until 1940 was hanging in the state of Mississippi. And that's when the electric chair arrived. But we only had one in the state. And the law then said you had to be executed in the county where you were convicted. So we were the only state that did have a traveling electric chair. Meridian, their tallest building for a long time, was named the 3-Foot Building. Now, it was named for the 3-Foot Brothers, and that was their last name. World record for keeping a plane aloft, 635 hours. That was in 1935, and it was the Key Brothers in Meridian, and their airport is named for the Key Brothers there. Most valuable crop per acre in Mississippi, sweet potatoes. Gerber, baby foods, is one of their big clients. And 80% of the state's production of sweet potatoes is in Chickasaw and Calhoun counties. And Vardaman calls itself the sweet potato capital of the world. It hasn't been named our state vegetable yet. In 1920, 87% of this state was considered rural. By 2010, the last census, it was only 55% rural. 68% of this state is still in forest land, and there are over 100 species of trees that are grown in our state forests. Now, one of the items that you can see if you look at a Mississippi thing, it says what to go and see in Mississippi. One of them is actually that big rocking chair that's there on Canal Road at the Dido Playing Furniture. The man that invented the dollar sign, you know, the S and the 2 lines, is buried near Pinckneyville, Mississippi. And he came up with that during the Revolutionary War. Senator Pat Harrison, who was from Gulfport, he was a famous collegiate baseball pitcher in the 1890s, and he was nicknamed the long, tall, canebrake sapling. First newspaper to get to the moon. Thanks to Fred Hayes, it was our very own Daily Herald, Sun Herald now. I think he had been a paper carrier as a child and took that with him up there. That ought to about do it. I'm going to give you one more very critical piece of trivia. That there are 38 times more chickens in Mississippi than there are people. So with that, in the immortal words of the king, thank you. Thank you very much. And just today, there's something on the front page of the Herald, or second page or third page or somewhere. Gaucher is having a big thing tomorrow night that will celebrate the visual, musical, literary, and culinary arts for which Mississippi is known. I said they must have read this.